Her body spoke to him as she swam in the sea. Just watching her there was intoxicating. She splashed around in the water as it flowed through her soft skin. Williams was mesmerized as he watched from the edge of the ship. Her movements enticed him to keep watching her as she swam in the middle of the ocean. He was not sure if what he was seeing was real or just a fantasy. Her fins splashed in the water, so beautiful, you could have never guessed they were the perfect way to lure you in. He could not take his eyes off her as her scales glimmered from the waist down. Her bright blue tail emerged from the water, and he forgot about everything else in the world. One thing to remember when you see a siren is to never forget all those myths you have read about, because they are very real. It is true that they sing so wonderfully, although you should care to remember that this exact reason is why they are not mindful of your humanity. Their voice will take you to a place where your soul is at peace with their humming. But that is not all. You will meet their wrath on their bad days, and you will recall your worst memories. They will make each of your memories feel alive. Meanwhile, the water will hypnotize you to come and join them as it sways. It will be like entering into a magical world that feels all too real. A place of complete and utter fascination in the creatures that will make you want to be alive in the heart of their domain, a place you will never want to leave. And those moments washed away his feelings with him, but he barely remembered that if he truly let go, they would kill him. He was a young man that had a long life ahead of him, but not if he continued on this path, forsaken by the sirens, a fate he did not have the strength to compete with. Schneider took a look around from the bridge of the ship, and he started to hear the sounds of the sirens from a distance. He was still aware, unlike Williams, and his hands shook frantically looking for anything that could help him. He was starting to lose faith, since he knew that there was only a limited amount of resources on the ship. Resources that they had both carved together throughout their lifetimes to survive. He realized what had happened all those years ago, and this would be the reason that they would not see another day. Schneider knew if they didn't escape right now, they would never live to see another day. The humming began to suck him in again, and he continued to fight it with all the strength he had left. Although, it was not as easy as it sounded, and to prove that Williams lost all control and dove into the waters heading right for the siren. It was too late for him, he'd never be able to return now that he was in their domain. At that moment Schneider thought there may be no hope for the young man that was like a brother to him. He could still try to save himself from the wrath of the sirens. Sorrow filled his body, but was also the reason that gave him the strength to run into the cabin and search for anything that could help. But his body started to disobey, and he could not help the power the sirens had over him. He continued to fight, and his body urged him to walk back onto the deck. He gripped the door handle right as he was about to step outside, and slammed the door shut with the last shred of control he had left. He kept his hand on the door as he looked around for a solution. A light bulb lit up in his mind, and he lunged towards the candle that had been lit in the middle of the room. The wax had been melting all evening as they readied their leave on the ship straight into the early evening. Before he could think any further, he closed his eyes and poured the melted wax into his ears. He refused to consider what would happen to his hearing after this night, but that was the least of his problems. His ears sealed shut from any sounds as moments passed by. The wax solidified inside his ear canal and settled. The sounds of the sirens dulled until he could no longer hear them. He raced onto the bridge and turned the ship away from the caves that were ahead of him. The waters would either kill him tonight or may show mercy upon his soul. That didn't stop his tears from falling down his face as he turned the ship towards the great wide ocean, hoping he'd survive the cold, harsh night. The sirens lured every man they could to their water-filled caves. Their home was purposefully kept close to the island that they settled on once they had no ability left to walk on land. They had lived there on the same island where Williams and Schneider grew up at an earlier time in history that carved them into the monsters they became today. There was no magic at that time, no signs of mystical creatures in the midst of their childhood either. Their magic was a darkness that came at a later time in their life, a tragedy that carved them into the predators that swim in the oceans today. Schneider remembered the story of the sirens that once roamed their island. They were women that came from the same tribe as theirs. The island had been pillaged one too many times when explorers were out in the world looking for treasures beyond their wildest dreams, and they always seemed to show up where they lived. They lost their men in battle from invaders arriving, only came to pillage their land and murder their animals, men and many of their young. Women mourned for their lost ones, and in their sorrow, they sang for what felt like an eternity. They would not stop because if they awoke from their sadness, all they would return to is their suffering. So, they sang until they fine-tuned their sorrow into wrath, that could be heard from miles away to control the rough actions of any man who desired to take what little they had left, especially their families. And an undying psychic connection between them formed on that night as they sang, on the night they lost everything they ever loved. They vowed that they would never love again, only use the men that had destroyed their lives, and then thrown away like piles of dirt. The Sirens decided to lure in sailors from all corners of the sea and cannibalized on their human flesh as revenge. But as you know, all magic has consequences, especially when there is murder involved. The depths of the earth knew that these women, who had lost so much, should never wander the earth among their own people anymore, however many were left on that tiny island. For each time they murdered, they feasted on their fellow humans to survive. They would each grow a scale below their waist. They were banished from the island when those who survived alongside them had finally had enough of the Sirens causing casualties and deaths with the sound of their voice. The remaining families built ships and took them to lands close by to bring back fruits and animals as it once was. The Sirens were not particularly happy that their families lived peacefully. It angered the Sirens, so they lured their own children into the oceans and killed them one by one. That left Williams and Schneider, two young children that survived past 17 years old with their surviving families. Their pure souls allowed them to survive on the island where they grew up, but they were no longer children immune to the sound of the Sirens. They were young men curious of what opportunities life had in store for them. Two young men who never stopped dreaming of a life beyond their tiny island. So, they took the blueprints left behind in Schneider's father's study, a ship he planned to build while he was alive. He taught Williams his father's craft of building ships in his workshop that was left for him. It still took both of them 5 years to perfect the ship his father had dreamt of creating, his final masterpiece. They had tested the sails of the ship when they were sure it would not drown. Both young men set sail the day after, not knowing the disasters that would await them that night. They packed their stuff in the ship that late afternoon, so they could set sail in the early evening and reach the mainland in time for late drinks at a bar that night. They had always been told stories from the travelers that survived that there was a pub close to the docks where they could try every alcoholic flavor known to man. They had waited years for this day where they could finally have the answers that life would bring to them. They were so excited as they left for their destination, with only one reaching land safely in the end.